The addition of the Scadutree Fragments and Blessing levels was a very surprising one, given there has never been a leveling curve system like this in the prior Fromsoftware DLCs, and it has certainly stirred a lot of discussion in the community, it seems, on whether it was a necessary addition in the first place. So, why did they decide to implement this system into the Shadow of the Erdtree? Let's talk about it. The generally accepted level for entry to the DLC is anywhere from rune level 120 to 150. This information has been circulated since before the DLC launch, and it makes sense, as that's a reasonable level to reach a Moog and roughly a good level to fight him at. If you build your character efficiently, this basically means your character is complete as well. From there, any additional levels you get will just be a bonus to your character. But therein lies what I imagine FromSoft identified as a problem. If they wanted you to access this DLC at effectively endgame, but you don't have a much more straightforward way to level up your offense or defense, their options were very limited. I know people love their Golden Vow, but that spell, or anything similar being a requirement for every build going into the DLC, would go against the build freedom they likely want you to have. They could change the scaling of the stats, like say changing how much HP you get above 60 Vigor, to not have as much diminishing returns as there are now. That would break the entire balance of the base game, without even stepping foot into the DLC, so surely that was out of the question. It would retroactively make bosses like Millennia easier in theory, and don't get me started on what that would do to the multiplayer systems. They could have all the bosses be scaled roughly equivalently, which in a way could have worked fine, but I'm sure they did want you to have some sense of progression that wasn't just tied to the difficulty of the bosses. Not to be a power scaler or anything, but with equal stats, Renala probably would have been harder than Mesmer or Romina. And you could argue she already is, but I think that's more so a result of them treating Relana as an optional boss, whereas Mesmer and Romina are purely mandatory, and they're following the idea in game design that optional challenges should be harder than mandatory challenges. And you're also more likely to find Relana with far fewer fragments, as the game is now, than Mesmer and Romina. Another option they could have had in the other direction is having the DLC accessible earlier, let's say after Lindell, at give or take level 80 to 100, and that the DLC would be a more linear experience, like they have for pretty much all the DLCs they've made thus far, which could result in, say, Dancing Lion being scaled to Morgoth, Mesmer to Fire Giant, Radon to Millennia or end bosses, stuff like that. But I'm sure that was either never considered or shot down quickly, as it would stray from the format of the base game too much. Who's to say the success of Elden Ring was inevitable, or if being open world was a major contributing factor, but undoubtedly they wouldn't think it's worth deviating from that. This could also be broken by the sheer fact that you could just decide to not go into the DLC as early as you can. So say you do all the endgame first, once you go into Dancing Lion, Relana, Mesmer, you'll just destroy all of them, so even this would still complicate things. And this is also ignoring the fact that they kinda shot themselves in the foot by obviously making the DLC entry point after Moog. The second they decided to do that, they couldn't go back. I'm sure there's possibilities they could have, or maybe did float around, but after all was said and done, they settled on the system we have now. An external level up system that increases both your attack power and defense that would only affect you in the DLC areas, and was tied primarily to exploration, rather than farming or progression. The Scadutree Fragment and Blessing level system. Even explaining how they could come across this design choice, I'm sure there's one more question nagging at you right now. Why bother with a system like this in the first place, when they didn't need it in the prior DLCs? Outside of being an open world DLC compared to those, I think I have two possible explanations. One, in pretty much all prior games, even if you cleared the entire vanilla content, oftentimes you still didn't have enough levels to finish your build. Most games had the dedicated PvP meta be at level 125, because that's when you can have a reasonable build complete. And while that's a completely fan-made concept, it's a good basis to go off of. In Dark Souls 3, I want to say you finished the game at like level 80, 90, and that's excluding the DLCs. So there's some leeway in leveling into the DLC as well, where your build likely still benefits from it. I think this would also explain why the DLC enemies and such don't drop as many runes as you'd expect they would. They obviously didn't want to put so much emphasis on your rune level. And two, it's worth remembering the sheer amount of bosses there are in Shadow of the Erdtree DLC compared to the Ring City or something. In the prior DLCs, FromSoft only needed to balance for 3 to 4 bosses on average, versus around 80 in this one. Even if you break it down to only major ones, you'll still get a double-digit number. And you could follow the logic that they probably wanted to balance them roughly in batches, so most bosses in Graveside Plain probably could be tackled in around the same Scadu Fragment level, probably similarly for Scadu Altus, etc. It's possible that either of these are true, both of them at once, or neither? You'd have to ask FromSoft themselves for any direct answers. These are just reasons I thought of that could explain why they decided to do a system like this one time. But now that we have theory crafted some possible justifications for them introducing the system, let's get into the ways it went wrong. In a vacuum, I don't have anything against this system. It's definitely inferior to simply leveling your character overall, because there's no decision making to it, nor does it distinguish your character in any way. It's just an objective increase to both your offense and defense with no risk-reward factor at play, a fundamental aspect of Fromsoftware's games. But it was introduced to the DLC simply as a leveling curve system, and an additional reward for exploration. Therein lies part of the problems, however. The way they decided to distribute these around the world was very flawed. The sad part being that they were so close to getting it right. The Miquella Cross system was such a good way to telegraph where to find Scadutree Fragments. It is a landmark that can be spotted from very far away, sometimes being in a tricky location to reach. But once you pick up on the fact that all the crosses have a fragment, it is undoubtedly something you want to seek out. The only thing that would make it slightly better is if you could pin the location in a similar way to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, where you could zoom in on it and pin it from the camera. I found myself trying to do this manually with the map, and it was certainly tedious. The implementation that I thought was second best was giving them to the golden hippos. Having a very particular, recognizable enemy carry them was also not a bad choice. But even this, I already found a bit lacking in execution, due to there only being a handful the entire DLC. I certainly would have put one in the main gravesite plain area, maybe where the Ghost Flame Dragon is, since the hippos do favor water areas. However, it should also be mentioned that it's somewhat random that hippos are the ones that carry them, out of all enemies. I'm sure there's some lore justification or whatever, but perhaps it would have been more fitting if there were like mini Scadutree avatars around the world. That would telegraph this better, design-wise. The parallel would mirror the Erdtree avatars, knowing that they drop an important item. Hell, if you want to take it a step further, you could have minor Scadutrees as well. Fragments are certainly even more important than Crystal Tears were in the base game, so it would be worthwhile highlighting them this much. Third in the ranking is the statues. I don't think they're as good because of how hidden a lot of them turned out to be. You'll basically only notice you're about to get a fragment when you're already in the vicinity of it. It also doesn't help that some statues will turn out to just be revered spirit ashes, which ends up muddying the waters when it comes to the external reward systems. And yes, I know the statues for their ashes are different, but this is more of an argument for being seen from afar. You wouldn't be able to tell from afar which statue is which. It's not like I think revered spirit ashes shouldn't exist though. They just should have had a completely different way to reward you with these. If more of the Scadutree Fragment statues had been handled like a small church to the southeast of the First Grace, in Gravesite Plain, or the church defended by the bowl-cut Mesmer Knight guy, I would have been a lot more partial to this. As it stands now, this method is very flawed. And dead last is basically how the rest of them were handled. Overworld loot, the shiny pod guys, doesn't matter. They're all terrible methods of telegraphing how such an important item can be found. So I hope by now my overall thoughts have been expressed through these examples. These items are too important to be treated as normal items in the overworld. They need some sort of incentive and distinction in order to get the players to look for them and find them. They can still be in tricky places to find, but they should be visible from afar to encourage you to explore. Otherwise, it's just an item you may happen to find if you decide to take a peek at a random corner of the map, and they can't be boiled down to that. By now, I do wonder if you picked up on the parallel to Breath of the Wild and stuff, as I mentioned earlier, with the shrine system in that game, which serve a similar purpose, given they both give an upgrade to your character. I'm not saying that system is perfect either, I do think it works for that game, but the only reason I'm favoring this kind of example is because it is sort of what they already do with the Miquella crosses. Instead of trying to pivot this reward system into like a boss reward, which could be a fine way as well, I'm simply working with what the game already gives me and expanding on it, or what I would consider correcting it in some way. And that's not to mention how many there are in the game. It's way too many to keep track of. If you didn't know, the total number of them in the DLC are 50. I would definitely cut the amount to about half or so, and just have every level up be a more significant increase. That would also embolden you to find more, if you can actually feel the effects of the blessing level increase even more so than you can now. But now let's move into some of the repercussions of how this system was implemented. The first main problem we've already pretty much discussed with the last segment. Exploring for these in itself is not very intuitive outside of the Miquella crosses and maybe golden hippos. If I had it my way, I would have boiled down all of them to only these two, or maybe just the crosses alone. The second problem that comes across due to the current system is that replayability suffers greatly. Thankfully, it does appear that your blessing level does carry over to New Game Plus. But if someone wants to replay the DLC with a fresh character, or a second one they already had, they would need to recollect these fragments. And raise your hand if you want to actively do that, just to replay whatever parts of the game you do enjoy. I doubt it's many of you. And no, I won't hear the argument of getting better at the game as a legitimate solution for having to collect them. Think of it this way. The average player probably won't replay the DLC as immediately as a lot of us diehard fans will. Maybe never at all. But if they choose to do so, it may be weeks, months, or even years down the road. So even if they got pretty good at some of the boss fights in the first playthrough, it's unlikely that they will retain that after so long. To put it bluntly, this is what FromSoft wants us to do, despite what the Get Good crowd wants to believe, which honestly should be rebutted by the pure existence of a Scadutree Fragment system. The vast majority of players won't and don't want to do challenge runs. They just want to enjoy the game as is. And the current system does complicate that, especially if you're also going to be looking for the revered bear dashes. So that number goes up from 50 to even higher. You could make a similar argument about golden seeds in the base game, but the main difference between golden seeds and Scadutree Fragments is that there's an abundance of golden seeds, certainly many more than what you need to cap your flasks. So there's a lot of leeway in which golden seeds you need to find and remember. There's a better argument to be made about sacred tears, since there are only the 12 that you can get as the max, and it is a little bit more tedious to go around getting those because of that. I have made that argument in the past, but at the very least there are only 12, versus the nearly 4 times amount of fragments in the DLC. I think by now is a good time to acknowledge the elephant in the room. As much as I explained the logic behind a lot of the choices, and how it could have worked out okay, I do think this is basically the final nail in the coffin for the current open world format. If you enjoy the open world of the base game and DLC thoroughly, that's fine. But so much of what I've discussed would have never been an issue if the game, or at the very least this DLC, wasn't open world, just as the prior DLCs hadn't been. And I think it's imperative that I point that out. I'm not saying it's impossible to do the Souls formula in an open world format or anything, but we need to keep this in mind if FromSoft is going to continue pursuing open world going forward. Okay, I'm recording this at a later point because I actually did some crowdsourcing about what people thought about the system more specifically. I put a Twitter question and a poll on YouTube, encouraging people to discuss in the comments. As you can see from the votings, well, out of the third of an option, the votes are in majority for. It's not by much, and there's definitely a very big divide on what people thought about it. A lot of the replies boiled down to, I thought the system was good, but. I thought the system was fine, but. A lot of caveats on them. So even if you do like the system, you can tell for a lot of people it could have been better. And that's kind of where I fall as well. Like, I would say I'm in the indifferent to okay realm of thought on the system, in a vacuum like I said earlier, but it does have a lot of flaws that bring it down a good amount. And for the record, this was all done after I wrote my script, so everything up until now has been my thoughts and my reasoning. But there was a lot of comments that actually had very similar thoughts without obviously having read my script yet. A lot of people talked about the abundance of them, like the golden seeds would have been a good way to implement them. Some talk about how it's basically a band-aid solution to a bigger problem, which is definitely accurate, because at the end of the day, this was definitely the most simple way they could have tackled this, without really making any sort of statement or consequence to the actual game. As I said earlier, there's no decision making or build crafting to this system, and there's no reason not to do it unless you don't want to get too overpowered. It was basically the path of least resistance with what they wanted to do, I suppose. Now, one thing that I didn't mention that I actually didn't think about and several people commented on in my posts was the comparison to Sekiro, one that I had forgotten. So if you're unaware, in Sekiro, the only 2 ways to upgrade your character specifically, because it is not an RPG, is to defeat bosses. Defeating major bosses granted you remembrances, which increase your attack power, and beating something akin to a mini boss will give you more health and I think posture as well, which is a mechanic in Sekiro. So that is an example of a way they've done this in the past even, but instead of making it based on exploration, it's based on progress through bosses and combat and all of that. Now, in my opinion, I don't think it's the obvious way to go about it, because as I said, Sekiro is not an RPG, it is a very combat-based game compared to any of the Souls games. Like, I know it's widely known for its bosses and combat, but I would say that the priorities are kind of more widespread. And when talking specifically about Elden Ring, while combat is a focus of it, you could argue exploration is just as much or more of a thing in this one, especially over Sekiro. So following this thought process of each of these games having their own game philosophies, I think the Sekiro method works for that. In theory, the fragment system works for this one. But as mentioned before, throughout this whole video, it does have issues as well. But nonetheless, it's still a good point to point at. It is something that I had completely forgotten up until I read some of those comments. And overall, honestly, very good discussions. Not that I agree with every single one, but I'm always willing and happy to hear people's thoughts. But now, that's the end of the video. This one I feel really good about. The script kind of just flowed out of me whenever I thought of the idea of the script. And I'm happy to have some community thoughts included as well. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. I mentioned prior that I actually want to make a positive video next. So I think that is what will happen for the next video. So we'll be discussing some of the positives of the DLC. Which overall I didn't like it, but I do think it's worthwhile to, highlight some of the good things they did and, the effort they put into the DLC. Because they did put a lot of effort into it, even if the results were a mixed bag. But if you're new here or haven't watched before and aren't subscribed yet, do consider doing so. I also have memberships open if anyone wants to support. Thank you for my current members who do support my channel. And you want to see more from me, I do have prior videos of both the DLC and the base game, criticizing a lot of micro elements of it in depth, or some broader videos for the entire DLC or base game. Not always negative, but they're there. So yeah, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again. Bye bye.